The air inside the obsidian spur station was a thick, stagnant soup of recycled oxygen, burnt grease, and the metallic tang of ionizing radiation. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die quietly, buried under layers of rust and bureaucratic indifference. Kalen Voss moved through the crowded main concourse with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent 15 years staring at data terminals until his eyes felt like they were filled with sand. He was 38 years old, his dark hair already streaked with premature gray at the temples, and his back carried a slight permanent curve from a lifetime of calculating freight margins for captains who didn't know his name. He reached for his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of a digital slate that held the deed to his future. He had spent every last credit of his severance pay on a vessel he had only seen in low-resolution, grainy holograms. It was a gamble, a desperate leap away from the sovereign hegemony and the guilt that had been eating him alive ever since a logistics error he authorized 2 years ago resulted in the starvation of an entire mining outpost in Sector 9. He didn't want to fix numbers anymore. He wanted to fix something he could touch. Bay 47 was tucked away in the gutter of the station, where the lighting flickered with an irregular, dying pulse, and the deck plates groaned underfoot. Standing there, waiting for him, was the Nomad's Sci. It was a ragged, decommissioned, long-range runner, its hull scarred by micrometeorites, and its original paint stripped away by solar winds until it looked like a bleached bone floating in the gloom. Bax, the dock clerk, was a man who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts and bad decisions. He stood by the docking pylon, nursing a cup of synthetic coffee that smelled suspiciously like floor cleaner. He didn't look up when Kalen approached. "You the one who bought this heap?" the clerk asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Kalen Voss," Kalen replied, his voice steady. "I have the confirmation code." Bax grunted, tapping a few commands into his terminal. "Sign the waiver. No refunds, no warranties, and if the atmospheric seal blows 10 meters past the beacon, don't bother calling the station guards. They don't do salvage for junk." Kalen pressed his thumb to the screen, watching his name attach itself to the ship's registry. The bond was final. He was no longer an analyst. He was a captain of a ship that looked like it would fall apart if someone coughed too loudly near the starboard thrusters. "Watch out for the vents," Bax added, tossing a physical key fob toward Kalen. "These old runners collect shadows. Sometimes the shadows bite back." Kalen didn't respond. He climbed the ramp, the metal vibrating beneath his boots with a hollow, mournful sound. The interior was even worse than the exterior. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and long-forgotten meals. The main corridor was a tunnel of peeling thermal insulation and exposed wiring that hung like vines in a mechanical jungle. He moved toward the bridge, his mind already running through 1,000 repairs. He needed to check the fuel injectors, the life support scrubbers, and the integrity of the primary ghost drive. He reached the center of the ship, a small nexus that connected the galley to the crew bunks. He stopped. He wasn't sure why, but the silence felt wrong. A ship at rest should have a steady, predictable hum, a mechanical heartbeat that reassured the soul. But this ship felt like it was holding its breath. Then he heard it. It was a thin, high-pitched sound that traveled through the ventilation ducts, a shaky, broken sob. It was the sound of a child trying to be invisible and failing. Kalen froze. His heart, usually a disciplined metronome of logic, skipped a beat. He followed the sound, his boots clicking softly on the deck. He reached a maintenance panel near the cargo bay floor. The screws were loose, the edges of the metal plates scratched as if they had been pried open and shut in a hurry. He knelt, his hand trembling slightly as he rested his palm against the cold metal. The crying stopped instantly. A terrifying silence took its place. "I know you're in there," Kalen said, his voice low and devoid of the harshness he usually reserved for dock officials. "I'm the new owner. I'm not here to turn you in." No answer, only the faint, rapid thrumming of a heart beating against the other side of the wall. Kalen took a small multi-tool from his belt and slowly, deliberately unscrewed the remaining bolts. He pulled the panel back. The metal groaned, a protest that echoed through the empty ship. Inside the cramped, dark cavity, two figures were huddled together. A woman with jade-green skin that shimmered faintly even in the darkness, her long white hair tangled and matted with dust. She was wrapped around a small child, her arms locked in a protective embrace that left no room for the girl to even move. The woman's eyes were wide, dark pits of defiance and terror. She looked at Kalen as if he were the executioner come to finish the job. The child, a girl no older than 6, pressed her face into the woman's neck, her small hands clutching a thin torn fabric. Her skin was a paler shade of cyan, and her breathing was a series of jagged, shallow gasps. The woman didn't plead. She didn't beg. She simply bared her teeth, a silent snarl of a cornered predator. "How long have you been in there?" Kalen asked, his chest tightening with a sudden, sharp pain. "3 rotations," the woman finally spoke, her voice a parched whisper. "Leave the panel open. We will be gone before you lift off. We don't want your trouble." "You're starving," Kalen observed, looking at their hollowed cheeks and dry lips. "And the carbon levels in that crawl space are high enough to cause brain damage in an hour." The woman didn't move. "We have survived worse than bad air." Kalen looked at the child, who dared to peek out from behind her mother's hair. Her eyes were a brilliant, haunting silver. She looked at Kalen not with malice, but with a profound, soul-deep curiosity. "I'm Kalen," he said, sitting back on his heels to make himself look smaller. "I bought this ship to get away from people who follow rules blindly. If I call the station guards, you'll be processed as unregistered debt slaves within 20 minutes. If I leave you here, you'll suffocate before I hit the jump point." He stood up, ignoring the way the woman flinched. "I'm going to the galley to get water and 2 ration bars. Stay where you are. If you try to run, you'll just run into Bax, and he's much less inclined to share his breakfast." He walked away, his mind racing. He was a man who lived by risk assessment, and the risk here was astronomical. Harboring unregistered Telluric refugees was a crime that carried a 10-year sentence in a Hegemony work camp. But as he reached the galley and gripped the edge of the metal counter, he thought of the outpost in Sector 9. He thought of the faces of the people he had never met, the people who had suffered because he chose to be efficient instead of human. He filled 2 cups with water and grabbed the only 2 protein bars he had brought for the trip. When he returned to the panel, the woman was still there, but she had shifted slightly, shielding the child even more. "Drink this," Kalen said, sliding the cups into the cavity. "Slowly. Your stomach won't handle a rush." The woman hesitated, her eyes searching his face for the hidden trap, the cruel bargain that usually followed such kindness. Seeing none, she reached out with a trembling hand and took the cup. She didn't drink first. She held it to her daughter's lips. The girl drank with a desperate intensity, her small throat working as she swallowed. Only when the child was finished did the woman take a sip herself. "What's your name?" Kalen asked. "Rin," she said, her voice slightly stronger. "And this is Alora." Kalen nodded. "The manifest for this ship says it's a solo operation, Rin, but solo ships get scanned twice as often at the checkpoints. If I'm going to get you past the ring, I need to update the registry to a family vessel. It costs 50 credits and a lot of questions I'm not ready to answer, but it's the only way you don't end up in a cage." Rin stared at him, her jade skin flickering with a soft, bioluminescent pulse of confusion. "Why would you do this for us? We have nothing to give you. No credits, no cargo." "Because I spent 15 years doing what was profitable," Kalen said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'd like to try doing what's right for a change." He offered his hand. "Come out of the wall, Rin. It's time to start moving." As the jade-skinned woman took his hand, her fingers cold and thin, Kalen felt the weight of his old life finally begin to slip away. He had bought a cheap ship to find his freedom, but he was starting to realize that freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing who you were willing to carry with you through the dark. The Nomad's sigh shuddered as the primary thrusters coughed to life, sending a series of metallic groans through the hull that sounded like the ship was physically protesting the idea of movement. In the small, cramped cockpit, Kalen Voss focused on the flight sequence, his fingers moving with a precision that belied the sweat dampening his collar. He had never actually piloted a vessel this large outside of a simulator, but the logic of orbital mechanics was the one thing that still made sense in a universe that had suddenly turned upside down. Beside him, strapped into the spare co-pilot seat with a harness that was clearly designed for someone twice her size, was Alora. She was silent, her large silver eyes fixed on the view screen as the obsidian spur station began to shrink into a tiny speck of light against the velvet blackness of the void. Rin stood behind them, her hand gripping the back of Kalen's chair so tightly her knuckles were white. She had refused to sit, her eyes constantly scanning the sensor arrays as if expecting a fleet of hegemony hunters to materialize at any second. "We are entering the first debris field," Kalen announced, his voice intended to be calm but carrying a slight tremor. "I need to calibrate the ghost drive. It's an old model, and it tends to run hot if the synchronization is off by even a fraction." "Is it safe?" Rin asked, her voice sharp with a mother's instinctual suspicion. "It's as safe as anything else on the ship, which is to say we are mostly relying on luck and a few layers of reinforced titanium," Kalen replied. "But if we don't use it, the long-range scanners from the station will pick up our heat signature within 10 minutes. He reached for the cooling toggles, his mind calculating the energy dispersal. He felt the familiar rush of data, the way he used to analyze freight routes. But now the stakes weren't credits or delivery times. They were the two lives sitting inches away from him. Elora leaned forward, her small cyan finger pointing at a blinking amber light on the lower console. "That one is sad," she whispered. Kalen blinked, looking at the indicator. "That's the fuel-to-oxygen ratio. It's not sad, Elora. It's just inefficient. The scrubbers are old." The child tilted her head, her white hair swaying. "It sounds like it's crying, like the ship is tired." Kalen looked at Rin, who gave a small, weary shrug. "The Loric children are sensitive to energy flows," she explained. "She isn't just seeing the lights, Kalen. She's feeling the vibration of the systems." Kalen turned back to the console, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. He adjusted the flow, softening the intake. The amber light turned to a steady, comforting green. "Better?" he asked. Elora nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Better." They passed the outer beacon of the station, the transition from local space to the open expanse marked by a sudden, jarring shift in gravity. The ship creaked, a sound like a giant folding a sheet of metal. Kalen grabbed the comm set as the station's traffic control pinged them. "Bay 47, this is Obsidian Control. We show a discrepancy in your crew manifest. You listed solo, but our thermal sensors picked up 3 distinct heat clusters during your departure. Explain." Kalen felt Rin's hand tighten on his shoulder. He took a breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Control, this is Voss. I apologize for the delay in the paperwork. I updated the registry 10 minutes ago at the automated kiosk. I'm traveling with my dependents. Check the kinship vessel classification under code Alpha 9. A long, agonizing silence followed. Kalen could almost hear the clerk on the other end scrolling through a list of 1,000 ships, bored and eager to finish his shift. "Obsidian Control to Voss. Registry confirmed. You're listed as a family unit. Safe travels, Wanderer. Try not to let that junk pile stall in the shipping lanes." The connection cut out. Kalen let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He slumped back into his seat, his hands shaking as he released the controls. "We're out." Rin finally lowered herself into the small jump seat behind him, her jade skin glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse of relief. "You lied for us. You officially tied your name to ours in the Hegemony archives." "It's not a lie if I mean it," Kalen said, though the words felt heavy in the air. "As far as the galaxy is concerned, you are my crew, my family. If we get caught, there's no way for me to claim I didn't know you were here. I've burned my bridges, Rin." "Why?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. "You could have lived a quiet life. You had a job, a place in the system. Why throw it away for 2 strangers from a species the Hegemony considers a resource?" Kalen looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the viewport. He saw a man who had been a ghost for 30 years, a man who had been so afraid of making a mistake that he had stopped making any choices at all. "I once authorized a shipping route for a corporation called Synaptic Union," he said, his voice a low, hollow rasp. "It was efficient. It saved them 4,000 credits per transit. But it required the cargo ships to use a gravity well that disrupted the local climate of a small moon called Tolera. The people there were farmers. They didn't have the technology to fight back. When the harvest failed, they asked for help. The Hegemony calculated the cost of a relief mission and decided it wasn't worth the investment. He turned to look at Rin, his eyes hard with an old cold fury. I watched the numbers. I saw the population count drop from 5,000 to 0 over 8 months. I did nothing because it wasn't my department. I followed the rules, and 5,000 people died. He looked at Alora, who was watching him with wide silver eyes. I'm not following the rules anymore. I'm done being a cog in a machine that eats people. Rin reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. It was a brief, hesitant contact, but it felt like a bolt of electricity. On my world, she said, we believe that when you save a life, you become responsible for its story. You haven't just given us a ship, Kalen Voss. You've become part of our thread. Kalen managed a faint, tired smile. I hope it's a long thread, Rin, because I'm a terrible pilot and this ship is held together by hope and outdated adhesives. The ship settled into its long-range cruise, the stars stretching out into long, white needles as the ghost drive finally synchronized. The hum of the engine changed, becoming a deep, melodic thrum that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the cabin lights. Elora yawned, her small head drooping against the harness. Is it time for the story? She asked. Kalen looked at her, surprised. What story? The bedtime story, Elora said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. Mama says everyone who travels in the stars has a story. Kalen looked at Rin, who was watching him with a quiet, expectant gaze. He realized then that he didn't just have to be a captain or a protector. He had to be a human being again. I don't know many stories, he admitted, his voice rough. But I can tell you about a planet called Earth. It had oceans so blue they looked like fallen sky, and forests that stretched for 1,000 kilometers. As he began to speak, describing a world he hadn't seen in 2 decades, the small girl drifted off to sleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Rin leaned her head back against the bulkhead, her eyes closed, her jade skin glowing with a soft, cyan light that filled the small cockpit with warmth. Kalen Voss sat at the controls, watching the needle-thin stars of the expanse. He was a fugitive, a traitor to the hegemony, and the owner of a ship that was practically a relic. He had never been more terrified in his entire life. And yet, as he listened to the heartbeat of his ship and the breathing of the 2 people he had chosen to carry, he realized he had never felt more alive. The numbers were gone. All that remained was the journey. The silence of deep space was never truly silent. For those who lived within the titanium ribs of a starship, the void was a symphony of groans, hisses, and the omnipresent thrum of the reactor. Iden Mars sat on the deck of the maintenance crawlspace, his back pressed against a vibrating bulkhead that felt like it was trying to shake his teeth loose. It was 2,300 hours by the ship's internal chronometer, a time when the galaxy usually retreated into the shadows of sleep. But for the owner of a junk pile like the Homebound, sleep was a luxury bought with stable pressure seals and functional injectors. He held a hydrospanner in his grease-stained hand, staring at the primary coolant line of the ghost drive. The engine was a relic, a pulsing mass of copper coils and shifting magnetic fields that hummed with a haunting, low-frequency whine. It didn't just move the ship. It folded the local space-time in a way that left behind a trail of distorted gravity, a ghost that confused most long-range sensors. But right now the ghost was screaming. A soft scraping sound came from the hatch behind him. Iden didn't turn around. He knew the weight of those footsteps by now. The light in the galley is flickering again, Yara said. Her voice was a cool breeze in the stifling heat of the engine room. Rennie thinks the ship is hungry. Iden wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, leaving a smear of dark oil across his brow. The ship isn't hungry, Ayara. It's old. The power distribution grid has 3 bypasses that shouldn't exist, and the surge dampeners are probably made of recycled tin cans. Ayara stepped into the crawl space, her jade-green skin shimmering with a faint, uneasy cyan light. She had changed into the dark blue tunic Iden had bought her at the depot. It fit her well, the fabric draping over her slender frame and softening the sharp, defensive lines of her shoulders. She crouched beside him, her long white hair tied back in a practical knot. You've been down here for 4 hours, she observed. You're pushing yourself too hard, Iden. If I don't push, we drift, Iden replied, his voice raspy. And if we drift, we're just a target for the first scavenger with a tractor beam. He reached for a stubborn bolt, his muscles tensing. The spanner slipped, his knuckles barking against a sharp edge of the frame. He hissed a curse, dropping the tool. It clattered against the deck, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. Ayara didn't flinch. She picked up the spanner and held it out to him. Her eyes, those deep, infinite pits of cosmic dark, searched his face. Why do you carry it all alone? The ship, the risk, us. You act like the weight of the universe is on your shoulders, but you're just one man. Iden took the tool, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, but the warmth of her skin felt like an anchor in the cold mechanical world. I spent 15 years watching numbers move on a screen, Ayara. People lived and died by the decimals I moved. I carried that weight behind a desk where I couldn't even see the faces. At least here, I can see the people I'm responsible for. He turned back to the drive, his jaw set. It's not just about survival. It's about making sure that for once, someone gets where they're supposed to go. We're not a cargo manifest, Iden, Ayara said softly. I know that, he snapped, then immediately softened. I know, but the system doesn't. To the hegemony, you're a glitch. To the gilded hand, you're an asset. To me, he trailed off, the words sticking in his throat. To you, she prompted. To me, you're the first thing I've chosen in a long time. He finished, his voice barely a whisper. A small head popped up through the floor hatch. Rennie scrambled into the room, her oversized tunic trailing behind her. She was holding a small glowing crystal she had found in one of the storage crates. Iden, look. She chirped, her silver eyes wide with excitement. The engine is singing. I can feel the music in the floor. Iden, as he had rebranded himself, looked at the child. She was kneeling on the deck, her small palms pressed against the vibrating metal. She didn't look afraid. She looked captivated. It's not singing, Renee. It's harmonic resonance, Iden said, though he found himself smiling. No, it's a song, Renee insisted. It goes thrum, thrum, hiss, like a big cat. Ayara watched her daughter, a look of profound tenderness and lingering fear crossing her jade features. She has the catalyst trait, Iden. It's why they want her. She doesn't just see machines. She interfaces with them on a subquantum level. To her, the ship is a living thing. Iden froze, his analytical brain suddenly firing. The catalyst trait? That's more than just a genetic anomaly. That's why the Gilded Hand is using telluric refugees. They're trying to build organic navigation arrays. They're turning people into hardware. Ayara nodded, her bioluminescence turning a sharp, jagged violet. They take the children first. Their minds are more plastic, easier to graft into the warp drive systems. I killed 2 guards to get her out of the processing facility on Velonis Prime. We've been running through maintenance ducts and scrap piles ever since. Iden looked at Renee, who was now humming along with the engine. The horror of it hit him with a physical force. He had tracked shipments of bio-hardware in his old job, never asking what was inside the pressurized crates. He felt a sudden, sickening wave of self-loathing. They won't get her, Iden said, his voice hard as tempered steel. Not while this ship is still flying. That's a big promise for a man with a broken engine, Ayara said, though there was no mockery in her tone. Then let's fix it, Iden replied. He looked at Renee. Hey, little greaser. You want to help me find the sad part of the big cat? Renee's face lit up. She crawled over to him, her small fingers reaching for a screwdriver. Yes, I can show you where it hurts. For the next 3 hours, the engine room of the homebound was transformed. It wasn't just a maintenance task, it was a lesson in trust. Iden guided Renee's hands, showing her how to tighten the thermal couplers without crushing the delicate filaments. He explained the flow of plasma not as a mathematical equation, but as a river of light that needed to stay within its banks. Ayara watched them, her posture slowly losing its brittle edge. She began to hand Iden tools before he even asked for them, her movements becoming synchronized with his. They worked in a comfortable silence, broken only by Renee's occasional giggle or the rhythmic clack-clack of the hydrospanner. As the final injector clicked into place, the sound of the ghost drive changed. The harsh whine smoothed out into a deep, resonant purr. The lights in the corridor stopped flickering, and the air from the vents felt crisp and cool. It's happy now, Renee declared, patting the engine housing. Aiden sat back, his clothes soaked in sweat and grease, but his heart felt lighter than it had in decades. He looked at Ayara. She was staring at the engine, her jade skin glowing with a soft, steady cyan. You did it, she whispered. We did it, he corrected. He stood up, offering her a hand to help her up from the deck. This time, when her fingers met his, she didn't just brush them. She held on. We should get some sleep, Aiden said. We reached the Heliox outpost in 6 hours. It's a riftward territory. Lawless, gritty, and perfect for getting lost. Is it safe? Ayara asked. No, Aiden said honestly, but it's our best chance to buy the parts we need to disappear for good. We'll go in, get the scramblers and the fresh fuel cells, and get out before anyone notices a human traveling with a thaloric pair. As they climbed out of the crawl space, Aiden paused at the hatch. He looked back at the engine, the ghost drive humming its new, peaceful song. He realized then that he wasn't just repairing a ship. He was building a fortress, one bolt and one chosen moment at a time. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the profit margins. He only cared about the people inside the hull. The Heliox outpost was a jagged scar of metal and neon floating in the dark heart of the riftward territories. It wasn't a station so much as a collection of tethered junk, decommissioned freighters, and hollowed-out asteroids stitched together by rickety walkways and leaking pressurized tunnels. It was a place where the galaxy's discarded people came to trade secrets, forbidden tech, and lives. As the homebound slid into its docking berth, a rusted cradle of magnetic clamps and hissing steam, Aiden felt the old familiar tension return to his gut. He checked the viewport. The sky of Heliox was a chaotic mess of flickering signs advertising cheap synthale, illegal software wipes, and no questions asked repairs. Stay here, Aiden said, checking his sidearm, a battered plasma pistol he had pulled from the ship's emergency locker. Keep the internal sensors on high. If anyone so much as taps on the hull, you prime the thrusters and prepare to bug out. Ayara stood at the airlock, her hand resting on Renee's shoulder. The child was wearing her new blue tunic, her silver eyes darting toward the viewport with a mix of wonder and fear. I don't like you going out there alone, Ayara said. Her bioluminescence was a dim, cautious gray. The hand has eyes everywhere, even in the rift. I'm just a spacer looking for parts, Ayara. To them, I'm a nobody. If we go out together, we're a target, Aiden replied. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of white hair behind her ear. I'll be back in 2 hours. 50 credits says I can find a Mark IV scrambler for half price. Don't bet your life on a discount, Aiden, she warned. He nodded, sealed his suit, and stepped onto the docking ramp. The air on Heliox tasted of recycled smoke and old despair. Aiden moved through the bazaar, a sprawling maze of stalls built into the gutted remains of a heavy cruiser. The crowd was a blur of species, scaly Veskins, hovering throne delegates in environmental suits, and hard-eyed humans with more cybernetics than skin. He kept his head down, navigating by the glowing icons of his data slate. He needed a phase shifter for the ghost drive and a set of encoded transponder plates. If he could mask the ship's signature, they could disappear into the nebula dust where even the Hegemony's long-range scanners couldn't reach. Hey, static head! A voice called out from a nearby stall. Eden stopped. A man with a rusted bionic eye and a face like a crumpled map gestured toward him. You looking for the good stuff, or just wasting my oxygen? I'm looking for Mark IV components, Aiden said, keeping his voice neutral. And a scrambler that doesn't leak radiation like a cracked core. The vendor huffed, a sound like a failing exhaust pipe. Mark IV? You got the credits for that, or you planning on paying in scrap metal? Out here, we don't do charity work, grease monkey. Aiden produced a handful of physical credits, the gold-pressed latinum gleaming in the dim light. I've got the marks. You got the gear? The vendor's demeanor shifted instantly. Right this way, Captain. I've got a shifter that fell off a military transport 3 days ago. Clean codes, no ghosts. As Aiden followed the man into the back of the stall, his gaze drifted toward a flickering holographic board in the center of the walkway. It was a wanted list, the images cycling through a dozen faces. He felt his blood run cold. There, among the pirates and debt jumpers, was a high-resolution image of Rin. Subject, Catalyst 7. Property of the Gilded Hand. Reward 100,000 marks. Alive preferred. The price was high enough to buy a dozen ships like the Homebound. You interested in the bounties? The vendor asked, noticing Aiden's gaze. Hand's been pushing that one hard. Apparently the little one is worth more than a planet's worth of spice. Some kind of freak gin. Every hunter from here to the core is looking for a green girl with a white-haired shadow. Aiden forced his expression to remain flat. I don't do bounty work. Too much paperwork. Just give me the shifter. He completed the transaction with trembling fingers, the weight of the components in his bag feeling like lead. He moved back through the crowd, his mind racing. 100,000 marks. It was a staggering amount of money. Enough to disappear forever, to buy a new life on a paradise world. He thought about his old life. He thought about how easy it would be to just walk away. He could leave the ship, let the Gilded Hand find them, and collect a finder's fee that would erase every debt he ever had. He stopped at a food stall, the scent of fried grain spirals making his stomach churn. He looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror hanging from a pylon. He didn't see a freight analyst. He didn't see a cautious rule follower. He saw a man who had finally found something worth more than a number on a screen. He remembered Rennie's hand on his. He remembered the way she called the engine a big cat. He remembered the look in Ayara's eyes when she realized he wasn't going to turn them in. Family is a choice, he whispered to himself. He turned a corner, heading back toward the docking berths, when he saw them. Two men in sleek, dark environmental suits, their helmets opaque and their movements too synchronized to be anything but professional. They were standing near the pylon for Bay 47. One of them was holding a scanner, the blue light sweeping across the Homebound's hull. Static, Aiden hissed under his breath. He didn't run. Running invited a chase. Instead, he moved toward a maintenance access port 30 meters away. He knew these ships. He knew the conduits. He could reach the internal airlock through the service vents if he could just get past the sensors. He slipped into the shadows of a massive coolant tank, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched the men. They were talking into their comms, their postures tense. They're here, Aiden realized. The Gilded Hand. He reached for his comm set, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Ayara, don't answer, just listen. We have roaches at the door. 2 of them. I'm coming in through the port side vent. Be ready to depressurize the airlock on my mark. And Ayara, I'm not leaving you. There was a long beat of silence, then a faint clicking sound through the comm, the thaloric signal for understood. Aiden scrambled into the vent, the narrow space tight and smelling of ancient dust. He dragged his bag of parts behind him, his fingernails clawing at the metal. He moved with a desperation he didn't know he possessed. He wasn't just an analyst anymore. He was a man fighting for his home. He reached the internal hatch, the red emergency light flickering. He tapped the override code. The hatch hissed open, and he tumbled into the ship's secondary corridor. Ayara was there, a vibro blade in her hand, her jade skin pulsing a violent, protective purple. Rennie was huddled behind a crate, her silver eyes wide with terror. They're scanning the hull, Aiden gasped, pulling himself up. They haven't breached yet, but it's only a matter of time. We need to bug out. Now! The clamps are locked from the station side, Ayara said. We can't lift off without an override from the dockmaster. Then we don't lift off, Aiden said, his eyes gleaming with a reckless, analytical light. We jump. Inside the station, Ayara gasped. The feedback would tear the berth apart. We'd be KIA before we cleared the ring. Not if we use the ghost drive to phase the hull, Aiden said, already moving toward the cockpit. It's a theory I've been calculating since we left Obsidian. The drive doesn't just fold space, it shifts the mass signature. If I can overclock the injectors, we can slip through the magnetic clamps like they aren't even there. It's a 50-50 shot, Aiden, she said, following him. Better than the 0% chance we have if we stay, he replied. He slammed into the pilot's chair, his fingers dancing across the console. He installed the new shifter in a frantic blur, the wires sparking as he made the connection. Renee! Hold on to the cat, Aiden shouted. The child gripped the edge of the console, her small face set in a look of grim determination. Outside, the airlock began to hiss. The Gilded Hand was cutting through. Initiating phase shift in 3, 2, 1. Iden slammed the primary toggle. The homebound didn't just move, it vanished. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but white noise and the sensation of being turned inside out. Then, with a thunderous crack that echoed through the station's structural frame, the ship reappeared 5 kilometers outside the ring. The magnetic clamps had been sheared off, their metal twisted into impossible shapes by the spatial distortion. Iden gasped for air, the cabin lights flickering back to life. He checked the sensors. They were clear of the station, but 3 interceptors were already launching from the Heliox hangars. "We cleared the ring," Ayara said, her voice shaky. She looked at him, her jade skin glowing with a soft, miraculous cyan. "You really are a crazy grease monkey, aren't you?" "I prefer freight analyst with a death wish," Iden replied, his hands returning to the controls. "Now hold on. We're heading for the nebula dust. Let's see if these roaches can follow a ghost." As the ship accelerated into the dark, Iden looked at the family registry on the screen. He had chosen this path. He had chosen them. And as the distant stars began to stretch into lines of light, he knew that no matter how far they had to run, he would never look back at the numbers again. The nebula dust was less a place and more a state of existence. It was a sprawling, multi-layered veil of ionized gas and crushed stardust that stretched across 3 solar systems, a graveyard of ancient supernovas that glowed with a sickening, ethereal violet light. Inside the dust, sensors didn't just malfunction, they lied. Standard radar returns turned into jagged ghosts, and the magnetic interference was so thick it felt like the ship was wading through a sea of invisible molasses. Iden Mars leaned over the primary tactical display, his eyes bloodshot and his fingers twitching against the edge of the console. It was 0300 hours according to the internal clock, but time had become a fluid, meaningless concept. They had been inside the dust for 2 days, moving at a snail's crawl to avoid the massive, drifting ice rocks that could shear a hull open like a tin can. Behind him, the cockpit was dark, save for the rhythmic, pulsing glow of the ghost drive. The engine was holding, but the heat bleed was becoming a problem. The temperature in the cabin had risen to 30 degrees Celsius, and the air smelled of ozone and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. "You're staring at the static again, Iden," Ayara said. She was sitting in the co-pilot's seat, her jade skin looking almost gray in the dim violet light filtering through the viewport. She was holding a long-range scanner, her movements slow and deliberate. Renee was asleep in the bunk niche behind them, her small hand clutching the edge of the thermal blanket as if it were a lifeline. "I'm looking for the roaches," Eden muttered. "The hand didn't just let us walk away after that stunt at Heliox. They're out there, Ayara. I can feel the weight of their scopes." "The interference is too thick for a hard lock," Ayara replied, trying to offer a reassurance she clearly didn't believe herself. "Even a gilded hand tracker can't burn through this much soup." "They don't need a hard lock," Iden said, tapping a jagged peak on the screen. "They just need to follow the fuel bleed. The ghost drive is efficient, but it leaves a wake of ionized particles. To a specialized scope eye, we're a neon sign in a dark alley." He rubbed his temples, the analytical part of his brain, the part that used to calculate freight risks for the Hegemony, screaming at him to shut everything down and drift. But his new self, the man who had torn open a maintenance panel to find a terrified child, knew that drifting was death. "Iden, look," Ayara whispered, pointing to the bottom quadrant of the viewport. A shape emerged from the swirling violet mist. It wasn't a ship, not exactly. It was a jagged, lightless spire of metal, drifting aimlessly. As they drew closer, the homebound spotlight caught the faded markings on the bow. The Silent Sister. Eden felt a jolt of cold recognition that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. "Static? I know that ship." "You do?" "It was on the Sector 9 roster, a mid-range transport. It was carrying 500 refugees from the Talara colony. The ones I let the numbers swallow," Iden said, his voice dropping to a hollow rasp. He checked the sensors. The ship was cold. No reactor signature, no life support hum. It was a hollow shell, a tomb floating in the dust. But as the homebound drifted alongside the derelict, a faint, rhythmic clicking sounded through the hull mic. 3 clicks, a pause. 3 clicks. Someone's alive, Ayara said, her bioluminescence flaring into a sharp, protective violet. Manual distress signal. They're tapping on the interior bulkheads. Iden stared at the derelict. His old logic, the cold, efficient voice of the freight analyst, spoke up. Don't do it. It's a trap. Or even if it isn't, the cost of a rescue will burn our remaining fuel. We have 3 people to save. Adding more to the manifest is a statistical suicide. We have to move, Iden whispered. The hand is close. If we stop to board, they'll catch us. They're tapping, Iden, Ayara said, her dark eyes fixed on him. Renee heard it first. She woke up 5 minutes ago. She said the cat is crying because there are people in the dark. Iden looked back. Rennie was standing in the corridor, her silver eyes wide and wet with tears. She didn't say anything, but the way she gripped her oversized tunic spoke volumes. Statistics don't cry, do they? Iden said to the empty air. He slammed his fist against the console, a sudden, violent burst of frustration. He wasn't just an analyst anymore. He was the man who had bought a junk ship to find a soul. If he left those people to rot in the violet soup, he was just another cog in the hegemony machine. He was just another ghost. All right, Iden said, his voice hardening. Stow the chatter. We're doing a tethered boarding. Ayara, you take the primary airlock. I'll stay at the helm to keep the thrusters steady. We have 15 minutes before the heat bleed from the stabilizers makes us a beacon. What about the roaches? Ayara asked, checking her vibroblade. If the hand shows up, I'll vape them with the plasma vents, Iden said, a reckless spacer trash grin touching his lips. Now move, before the soup gets any thicker. Ayara nodded, her hand lingering on his for a heartbeat, a gesture of trust that felt more solid than any titanium hull. She grabbed a portable oxygen rig and headed for the airlock. Iden watched her go, then turned his attention back to the derelict. The silent sister loomed in the viewport, a monument to his past failures. He had authorized the route that had led this ship into the gravity well. He had moved the decimals that had turned 500 lives into a low-priority salvage. Not today, Iden whispered, his fingers dancing across the controls. I'm done with low priority. He edged the homebound closer, the docking clamps groaning as they struggled to find purchase on the derelict's jagged, ice-coated skin. Every second they stayed tethered was a gamble. Every second was a choice. And for the first time in his life, Iden Mars was happy with the odds. The interior of the Silent Sister was a nightmare of frost and shadow. Ayara moved through the main corridor, her spotlight cutting through the floating clouds of frozen condensation. The gravity plates were dead, leaving the debris of 500 lives to drift in the air like metallic snowflakes. She saw a child's shoe, a string of prayer beads, and a rusted data slate, all floating in the eternal cold vac of the derelict. Eden, I'm in the midsection, she said through the comms. Her breath was a frantic white mist inside her helmet. The air is thin, maybe 10% oxygen. Carbon scrubbers are long gone. Find the tappers, Ayara, Iden's voice came through, distorted by the magnetic interference of the dust. The hand is 10 kilometers out and closing. They've launched a probe. I can see the blue burn on the long-range scope. Ayara kicked off a bulkhead, propelling herself toward the source of the sound. The tapping was louder now, a desperate rhythmic pounding coming from the medical bay. She slammed her vibro blade into the door's emergency release, the sparks flying in the zero-G environment. The door hissed open, and a wave of stale, frigid air rushed out. Inside, huddled in a corner behind a reinforced shielding wall, were 4 people. 2 elderly, thaloric men, a human woman in a shredded uniform, and a teenager whose skin was a sallow, sickly shade of jade. They were wrapped in a single tattered thermal tarp, their eyes wide with a terror that had gone beyond screaming. Move! Ayara commanded, her voice booming in the small space. We have a tether. Follow the light. We can't, the human woman rasped, her lips cracked and bleeding. The boy, his leg is fused to the conduit. The shock dampeners failed during the jump. Ayara looked down. The teenager's leg was wedged deep between 2 buckled plates of the cooling system. The metal had contracted in the cold, pinning him like a specimen in a jar. Iden, Ayara said, her voice tight. We have a clank. The boy's pinned. I need to cut him out. Ayara, listen to me. Iden's voice was a jagged rasp of static. The roaches are 5 kilometers out. They've picked up our tether. If you stay to cut him out, the hand will vape the ship before you clear the airlock. You have to leave him. Take the 3 who can move and get out of there." "I'm not leaving a child, Aiden," Ayara snapped. "It's logic, Ayara. The statistics say—" "Burn your statistics," Ayara shouted. "He's not a number. He's a boy. Aiden, look at your screens. Look at the faces you saved." Back on the homebound, Aiden stared at the tactical display. The 3 gilded hand interceptors were glowing red on his scope, their plasma cannons charging. He looked at Renee, who was sitting on the floor of the cockpit, her hands pressed against the deck plates. "The ship is sad because you're lying, Aiden," Renee said, her voice small but piercing. "You don't want to be an analyst. You want to be a captain." Aiden felt a cold sweat break out across his back. He looked at the derelict, then at the interceptors. He could leave the boy. He could save Ayara and the other 3. He could save his ship. It was the correct move. It was the move he had been trained to make for 15 years. But he remembered the shelter on Ravendock. He remembered the man who had tried to take Ayara because she was useful. He remembered how it felt to be nothing but a resource. "Ayara," Aiden said, his voice suddenly calm. "How long to cut him out?" 2 minutes, maybe 3. "I'll give you 5, Aiden said. He grabbed the controls, his fingers flying across the console. He didn't pull away. He did something much more dangerous. He channeled the entire power output of the Ghost Drive into the homebound's rear stabilizers, then reversed the polarity. The ship didn't fly, it bucked. The sudden spatial distortion sent a shock wave through the nebula dust, creating a massive glowing rift of violet light. "What are you doing?" Ayara gasped through the comms. "I'm making a curtain," Aiden said, his eyes fixed on the scope. "The hand can't lock through a spatial rift. I'm overclocking the drive to create a local fog. We're going to be invisible for 5 minutes. But Ayara, the core is redlining. If you're not back in 5, the ship will melt around me." "Understood," Ayara said. The sound of the vibro blade cutting through titanium roared through the comms. Aiden watched the temperature gauges on his console. 100 degrees, 150. The cabin air began to shimmer with heat. Rennie was panting, her jade skin looking flushed and damp. "Aiden, the cat is very hot," she whispered. "I know, baby. Just a little longer," Aiden said, his hand resting on her shoulder. On the tactical display, the interceptors were circling the violet rift, confused by the sudden disappearance of their target. They were firing blind, their plasma bolts sizzling through the gas like streaks of blue lightning. 3 minutes, Aiden called out. "Core integrity at 60%. The ship groaned, a deep structural sound that vibrated in Aiden's marrow. He could feel the metal warping, the seals on the cockpit windows beginning to hiss as the pressure shifted. 4 minutes, Aiden said. "Ayara, talk to me." "We're moving. I've got him. The leg is crushed, but he's alive." "Get to the airlock. Bug out. Now." Aiden watched the cameras. Ayara emerged from the derelict's hatch, carrying the boy in her arms. The 2 elderly men and the human woman followed, scrambling across the tether line with a frantic 0G grace. The moment the last survivor cleared the homebound's airlock, Aiden slammed the emergency release. The tether snapped, whipping through the vacuum like a severed limb. "Jump!" Ayara screamed through the comms. Aiden didn't wait. He slammed the ghost drive into a hard burn, the ship lurching forward with a force that sent him slamming back into his seat. The homebound tore through the nebula dust, leaving behind a trail of violet fire. The interceptors tried to follow, but the spatial rift Aiden had created collapsed behind them, the resulting gravity well sucking the scouts into a chaotic spin. 10 minutes later, the ship emerged into the clear blackness of the riftward expanse. The stars were steady and cold, and the violet soup was a distant glowing smudge in the viewport. Aiden sat in the pilot's chair, his chest heaving. He looked at the console. The ghost drive was silent, the cooling fans whirring at maximum capacity. The ship was scarred, the hull scorched and pitted, but it was still flying. He stood up and walked into the galley. The 5 new passengers were sitting on the floor, wrapped in thermal blankets. The boy was lying on a foam pad, his leg bandaged with a medical gel pack Ayara had found in the locker. They were drinking warm water, their eyes darting around the ship with a mix of awe and disbelief. Ayara was sitting at the counter, her helmet off, her white hair clinging to her damp skin. She looked at Aiden, then looked at the survivors. 100,000 marks, she said quietly. Aiden blinked. What? The bounty on me and Renee, Ayara said, pointing to a small data tablet one of the elderly men was holding. They had it on the derelict's news feed before the power died. Every person on that ship knew how much we were worth. Aiden looked at the survivors. The human woman, her face thin and desperate, looked at him with a gaze that held a terrifying truth. We knew, she whispered. We knew the hand would pay for information. We were starving, Captain. We were dying in the dark. And? Aiden asked, his voice low. And we tapped, the woman said. We didn't tap to tell the hand. We tapped to see if there was anyone left in the galaxy who cared about the people instead of the marks. Aiden looked at Renee, who was sitting next to the injured boy, offering him a piece of a protein bar. She looked up at Aiden and smiled. The cat isn't sad anymore, she said. Aiden Mars leaned against the galley bulkhead, a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He had spent his life believing that numbers were the only thing that mattered. He had believed that survival was a calculation of costs and benefits. But as he looked at the 6 people in his galley, 6 people who had no credits, no cargo, and no value to the hegemony, he realized that the most expensive thing in the universe wasn't latinum or spice or fuel. It was the choice to keep going when the logic told you to stop. Welcome to the homebound, Aiden said, his voice raspy but clear. Get some rest. We've got a long way to go, and I'm pretty sure the coffee on this ship still tastes like spacer trash. As he walked back to the cockpit, Aiden realized the cost of his choice. The hand was still out there. They were more dangerous than ever now that he had openly defied them. But as he looked at the star map, he didn't see risks. He saw a route, a real one. The homebound was no longer a silent tomb of rusted bulkheads and fading echoes. It was a living, breathing creature, vibrating with the chaotic energy of 8 souls crammed into a space designed for 2. The air recyclers, once wheezing like a dying laborer, now hummed with a frantic, overclocked intensity as they struggled to scrub the carbon dioxide produced by the new additions to the manifest. The scent of the ship had changed again. The metallic tang of ozone was now layered with the earthy smell of thaloric medicinal salves and the savory, heavy aroma of rehydrated grain mash. Aiden Mars sat in the pilot's chair, his fingers tracing the worn leather of the armrest. It was 0400 hours, the deepest part of the ship's artificial night. In the viewport, the stars were smeared into long, crystalline streaks, a side effect of the Ghost Drive's lingering spatial distortion. They were 3 days out from the Heliox incident, drifting toward a hidden pocket of the riftward expanse known as the Maw of St. Jude, a graveyard of frozen gas giants and shattered moons, where the magnetic noise was loud enough to drown out a supernova. He closed his eyes, listening to the ship. He could hear Sora, the human woman from the derelict, whispering a lullaby to Tarek in the galley. The boy's leg was healing, but the trauma of the cold vac had left him prone to night terrors. Further down the corridor, the 2 thaloric elders, Vale and Kryn, were engaged in a low-frequency hum, a meditative practice that made the very deck plates beneath Aiden's boots vibrate with a strange, soothing resonance. You're thinking in decimals again, a voice said. Aiden opened his eyes. Ayara was standing at the edge of the cockpit, her jade skin shimmering with a soft, bioluminescent glow that cut through the shadows. She looked tired, the dark circles under her eyes contrasting sharply with her white hair. But the brittle defensive edge he had first seen in her was gone. She walked toward him, her bare feet making no sound on the deck, and rested a hand on his shoulder. I'm calculating the oxygen-to-fuel ratio for 8 passengers over a 14-day transit, Aiden admitted, leaning his head back. The numbers don't look good, Ayara. We are running at 120% capacity. If the scrubbers fail, or if we hit a gravity well that requires a hard burn, we're going to be breathing static within 48 hours. Ayara squeezed his shoulder, her thumb brushing against the seam of his flight suit. In my old life, we were taught that a ship was just a vessel for the soul. If the vessel is crowded, it just means the soul is larger. You saved them, Aiden. You can't start treating them like a math problem now. I'm not, Aiden snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. He took a breath, rubbing his face with his hands. I'm scared, Ayara. I spent my whole life making sure the math was perfect so no one would get hurt. And now the math is impossible, and everyone I care about is on the ship. Ayara moved around the chair, kneeling beside him so they were at eye level. Her silver eyes reflected the flickering lights of the console. The math was never perfect, Aiden. You told me about Sector 9. You followed the rules and the decimals were beautiful, but the people still died. On this ship, the math is a mess, but Tarek is sleeping. Sora is breathing. We are alive. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. You've changed, Aiden Mars. You're not the man who bought a cheap runner to hide from his ghosts. You're the ghost that haunts the Hegemony's nightmares. Aiden looked at her, and for a moment the weight of the responsibility felt like it might actually crush him. But then he felt the warmth of her hand, and the sound of Rennie's laughter drifted from the galley, a small, bright sound that felt like a defiance of the entire cold, dark universe. The cat is purring, Aiden, Rennie chirped as she bounded into the cockpit, her silver eyes dancing with mischief. She was holding a small metallic trinket that Vial had fashioned for her out of scrap wire. She says the roaches are far away. Aiden pulled the child into his lap, his heart softening. The cat has good ears, Rennie, but we still need to keep our eyes open. We're heading into the maw. It's a messy place. Lots of rocks, lots of static. Is that where we can be a real family? Renai asked, her voice turning serious. Aiden looked at Ayara. The word family hung in the air, a heavy, beautiful thing that none of them had dared to name until now. We already are a family, Renia, Aiden said, his voice thick with emotion. The maw is just where we're going to find a place to park the car for a while. The moment was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic chirping from the tactical console. Aiden's instinctual panic returned in a flood. He pushed Renee toward Ayara and slammed his hands onto the controls. Static! Something just tripped the long-range buoy I dropped at the edge of the system, Aiden hissed. He peered at the screen, his fingers flying across the keys as he tried to filter out the magnetic noise of the nebula. A single, needle-thin signature emerged from the chaos. It was moving fast, cutting through the ionized gas with a terrifying, predatory grace. That's not an interceptor, Aiden whispered, his blood turning to ice. The energy signature is too clean, too high yield. A gilded handhunter, Ayara asked, her bioluminescence turning a jagged, warning violet. No, Aiden replied, his eyes wide. It's the bargain hunter, Silas Vane's ship. He's the eraser. The Hegemony doesn't send him to collect assets. They send him to delete mistakes. The comms panel crackled to life, the speaker emitting a voice that sounded like dry parchment being torn. It was a cold, cultured tone that carried the weight of 100 successful executions. Captain Voss, the voice said, or should I call you Analyst Voss? I must say, your logistical maneuvers in the nebula dust were quite impressive. A 50-50 jump inside a docking berth? Most irregular. But the numbers always catch up, Kalen. They always do. Aiden gripped the flight stick, his knuckles white. Vane, you're a long way from the core. There's nothing out here for you. On the contrary, Vane replied, the sound of a soft, chilling chuckle echoing through the cockpit. I see a ship that is currently over-encumbered by 4 unregistered thaloric assets and 3 human accomplices. The Hegemony is willing to offer a very generous settlement, Kalen. 150,000 marks for the girl and her mother. The others, well, they can be written off as collateral damage. Aiden looked at Ayara. She was standing tall, her jaw set in a hard line of defiance, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. He looked at Renee, who was hiding behind Ayara's legs, her silver eyes filled with a fear that broke his heart. You have 10 minutes to power down your ghost drive and prep the airlock for boarding, Vane continued. If you comply, the Hegemony will overlook your recent career change. You can return to your desk, Kalen. You can be a nobody again, safe, secure, within the decimals. Aiden stared at the family registry on his screen. 150,000 marks. It was more money than he had earned in his entire life. It was a clean slate. It was the logical choice. Eden, Ayara whispered. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ship. He looked at the scarred metal of the console, the flickering green light that Renee called happy, and the empty ration packs scattered on the floor. He realized then that he didn't want to be a nobody. He didn't want to be safe. "Vane," Iden said, his voice steady and cold as a winter morning on Earth. "I've been an analyst for a long time, and I've done the math." "And?" Vane prompted. "And you're significantly underestimating the value of my crew," Iden said. He slammed the throttle forward, the homebound leaping into the darkness of the maw. "Ayara, get everyone to the midsection. Seal the internal hatches. We're going to have to pull a clank and vape move." "Iden, the ship can't handle a hard burn in the maw," Ayara shouted over the roar of the engines. "She'll handle it," Iden roared, a wild, fierce joy taking hold of him. "She's not a junk pile. She's my ship, and no one is deleting my family today." As the homebound dove into the swirling, violent mists of the St. Jude graveyard, Iden Mars felt the last of the freight analysts die away. He wasn't calculating risks anymore. He was making them. The Maw of St. Jude was a cathedral of chaos. Massive ribs of frozen methane and silicate rock floated in the violet gloom, some the size of cities, others as small as a human fist, all tumbling in an eternal, gravity-driven dance. The homebound wove through the debris like a frantic needle, its hull screaming as micrometeorites sandblasted the titanium skin. Iden's world had narrowed to the 3 meters of the cockpit. His hands were fused to the flight stick, his mind a blur of vector calculations and reactionary thrusts. Behind him, the bargain hunter was a sleek, black shadow, effortlessly mirroring his movements. Silas Vane wasn't just chasing them, he was herding them, forcing Iden deeper into the densest part of the graveyard, where the escape routes were closing like a cage. "Shields at 40%, Iden shouted, though he knew no one could hear him through the sealed hatches. "Ghost drive is redlining. We're bleeding heat like a punctured lung." The ship shuddered violently as a plasma bolt from the bargain hunter grazed the starboard engine pod. Warning lights flared across the console, a chorus of amber and red that mocked his attempts at control. "Voss," Vane's voice came through the comms, calm and predatory. "You're pushing that relic to its structural limits. In 3 minutes, your stabilizers will shear off, and you'll be nothing but a drifting coffin. Is this really the legacy you want? To die in the dark with a group of people you barely know?" Iden didn't answer. He couldn't. He was looking at the tactical display, his eyes searching for the one thing the math told him shouldn't exist. He needed a miracle, or at least a very large explosion. He saw it in the bottom corner of the scope, a massive rotating ice moon designated St. Jude 3. It was a hollowed-out husk, its core long ago mined away, leaving behind a series of subterranean caverns and maintenance shafts that tunneled through the entire diameter of the moon. "Ayara, talk to me," Eden yelled, hitting the internal comms patch. "We're holding." Her voice came back, strained but fierce. "Rennie is with Sora. The elders are keeping the stabilizers from melting with their resonance. But Iden, the ship is breaking. I can hear the metal crying." "Tell the cat to hold on for 5 more minutes," Iden said. "I'm going into the 3 cavern. Ayara, I need you to go to the secondary cargo bay. There's a manual release for the atmospheric venting system. On my mark, I need you to dump the entire reserve of ionized oxygen into the corridor." "What?" "Iden, that will leave us with 5 minutes of air." "Just do it, and Ayara, I love you." There was a heartbeat of silence, then a soft, choked whisper. "I love you too, you crazy spacer trash. Move." Iden slammed the homebound into a high G dive, the ship screaming as it plummeted toward the jagged surface of St. Jude 3. The bargain hunter followed, Vane's confidence evident in the way he closed the distance. "Going to ground, Kalen?" Vane chuckled. "A desperate move. There's no exit in the caverns. You're just choosing the color of your tomb." Iden didn't respond. He lined up the ship with the yawning mouth of the primary maintenance shaft, a tunnel of black ice and rusted support beams. He cut the ghost drive at the last possible second, the ship sliding into the tunnel with a sickening, metallic screech. The bargain hunter followed, its superior shields glowing as it brushed against the tunnel walls. "Now, Ayara, dump it!" Iden roared. In the cargo bay, Ayara slammed the manual lever. A massive cloud of ionized oxygen hissed out of the homebound's vents, filling the narrow tunnel with a thick, white fog. To a standard scanner, the fog was just gas. But to a high-yield quantum-lock sensor like the one on Vane's ship, it was a blinding, reflective wall of static. Vane's ship hesitated, its automated pilot systems struggling to calculate the sudden density shift. Iden didn't hesitate. He kicked the homebound into a violent 90-degree roll, sliding the ship into a narrow vertical service shaft that the bargain hunter was too large to enter. "Static! We're clear!" Iden gasped, but they weren't. The bargain hunter stopped at the mouth of the shaft and began to fire. Plasma bolts tore through the ice, the heat causing the tunnel to buckle and collapse. The homebound was trapped in a dead end, the ceiling above them beginning to rain down massive shards of frozen methane. "Voss," Vane said, his voice now cold with actual irritation. "Enough games. You've cost the Hegemony 3 million marks in damages today. I'm through with the settlements." A massive, heavy-duty harpoon shot out from the bargain hunter's bow, the magnetic tip slamming into the homebound's rear hull with a thunderous clack. The tether tightened, the hunter beginning to drag the smaller ship back out toward the open maw. "He's got us," Iden whispered, staring at the tension meter. "The hull won't hold the pull. He's going to tear the ship in half." He looked at the cockpit door. He could hear Rennie crying. He could hear Ayara shouting for the elders to brace the core. This was the calculation. This was the math. 1 ship, 8 lives. If he stayed, they all died. If he did the impossible, maybe some of them survived. Iden stood up, his legs shaking. He grabbed his plasma pistol and a portable demolition charge from the locker. "Ayara," he said into the comms, his voice steady. "Listen to me. I'm going to the rear airlock. I'm going to cut the tether from the outside." "Iden, no. You'll be vaped. The hunters will kill you the second you step onto the hull." "I'm an analyst, Ayara," Iden said, a sad, peaceful smile touching his lips. "I've run the numbers. Vane won't fire on me. He wants the assets alive. I'm the only one he doesn't need. If I can distract him, if I can blow the harpoon mount, you can use the Ghost Drive's final burn to clear the moon." "Iden, please. Take care of Renai," he said. Tell her the cat found her way home." He cut the comms. He stepped into the airlock, the red light bathing him in the color of blood. He could feel the ship groaning under the strain of the tether, the metal screaming in protest. He opened the outer hatch. The cold of the void hit him like a physical blow, even through his suit. He stepped onto the hull, his magnetic boots clanking against the scarred metal. Above him, the bargain hunter loomed like a great black god of death. He could see Silas Vane in the viewport, the hunter's expression one of pure, cold curiosity. Vane didn't fire. He watched, fascinated by the suicidal defiance of the man he had dismissed as a nobody. Iden moved toward the harpoon mount, his hands numb. He placed the demolition charge on the magnetic base. He looked up at Vane and raised his middle finger. "This one's for Talara," Iden whispered. He triggered the charge. The explosion was a brilliant, blinding flash of white light. The harpoon mount shattered, the tether whipping back toward the bargain hunter like a giant, angry snake. The shockwave sent Iden spinning off the hull, his magnetic boots losing their grip as he was flung into the darkness of the cavern. "Now, Ayara, jump!" he screamed into his helmet mic, though he wasn't sure if the signal would carry. In the vertical shaft, the homebound's Ghost Drive let out one final, earth-shaking roar. The ship shifted, its mass flickering as it phased through the collapsing ice ceiling. With a thunderous crack, the ship vanished, leaving behind only a trail of violet stardust. Iden Mars drifted in the darkness of St. Jude 3. He was alone. He was freezing. He was a man who had finally reached the end of his math. But as he watched the spot where his ship, his family, had disappeared, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with physics. He had made a choice. He had valued 8 lives over his own decimals. He had finally become the captain he had always wanted to be. "Checkmate, Vane," Iden whispered, his eyes closing as the frost began to creep across his visor. The void was silent, but for the first time in his life, Iden Mars wasn't afraid of the shadows. He was part of the story now, and the story was beautiful. The void was not black. It was a hungry, crushing weight of violet static. Iden Mars drifted in the heart of the maw of St. Jude, his magnetic boots no longer tethered to anything but the indifferent pull of distant gravity wells. Inside his helmet, the sound of his own breathing was a ragged, mechanical rasp, echoing off the visor where frost began to bloom like frozen ferns. His heads-up display was a ghost of its former self, flickering with warnings in a language of amber light. Oxygen, 8%. Suit integrity, 64%. Internal temperature, falling. He watched the spot where the homebound had vanished. The spatial rift had closed with a silent, thunderous finality, leaving behind nothing but a smear of ionized gas that sparkled like diamond dust. Ayara was gone. Rennie was gone. The refugees were safe, or as safe as anyone could be in a ship held together by hope and the stubborn prayers of telluric elders. Eden closed his eyes. The math was finally simple. One man cast into the deep in exchange for 8 lives. It was the most efficient logistics maneuver he had ever performed. For 15 years, he had moved decimals to save credits for the Hegemony brass. Today, he had moved himself to save a family. He felt a strange, lightheaded peace. He wasn't a cog anymore. He wasn't a freight rate analyst. He was just a man named Iden, and for the first time, his life meant something because it had been spent willingly. Voss, a voice crackled through his helmet mic, cold and thin. Iden opened his eyes. The bargain hunter loomed 50 meters away, a sleek predator of black chrome and silenced thrusters. Silas Vane sat in the darkened cockpit, his face obscured by the reflection of the nebula's violet glow. The hunter's ship moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its scanners sweeping over Iden like a cold hand. A heroic gesture, Vane's voice continued, carrying that dry, cultured tone of a man who viewed mortality as a minor inconvenience. You've cost me a significant bonus, Kalen. The Hegemony doesn't pay for empty hulls. They pay for assets. Now I have a destroyed harpoon mount, a damaged sensor array, and a target that has jumped to God's nowhere. Iden managed a weak, parched laugh. Does it bother you, Vane? The fact that a nobody grease monkey broke your math? It irritates me, Vane admitted. But physics is a patient creditor. You are drifting in a graveyard with 5 minutes of air left. I could bring you aboard, put you in a cage, and spend the next month extracting your jump coordinates through much more unpleasant methods. Iden looked at the stars. You could, but you won't, because I'm a nobody, remember? I'm just collateral damage. Vane was silent for a long beat. You are a fascinating glitch, Kalen Voss, but you're right. You aren't worth the fuel it would take to dock. I'll leave you to the soup. Let the maw have your story. The bargain hunter's thrusters flared, a brilliant, silent blue. The ship turned on its axis and accelerated away, its wake sending a gentle ripple through the gas that knocked Iden into a slow, dizzying spin. He watched the black shadow shrink into a needlepoint of light and then disappear. He was alone, truly, mathematically alone. He looked at his oxygen gauge, 4%. The air in his lungs felt heavy, like he was breathing liquid lead. The cold was moving in now, a sharp, biting thing that started in his fingers and toes and worked its way toward his heart. He thought of the homebound. He thought of the way the galley smelled when Ayara was heating root mash. He thought of the way Renee's silver eyes would light up when she found a piece of singing scrap metal. I'm sorry, Emma, he whispered, the name of his lost daughter from Talara finally crossing his lips. I couldn't save them then, but I saved these ones. Then, a vibration hummed through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic pull of a moon's gravity. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thrum, a purr, a rift of violet fire tore open 20 meters to his left. The homebound lunged through the spatial distortion like a wounded beast, its hull scorched and its stabilizers missing, but its lights were blazing. It didn't glide. It bucked and groaned, fighting the magnetic interference of the maw with a reckless, frantic energy. The cargo bay door slammed open. A figure stood at the edge of the airlock, tethered by a thick orange safety line. Ayara! Iden tried to shout, but it came out as a choked wheeze. She didn't wait for him to move. Ayara kicked off the deck, her jade skin glowing with a violent, incandescent violet that cut through the darkness. She flew through the void, her arms outstretched, her long white hair trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She slammed into him with the force of a collision, her arms wrapping around his chest, her helmet pressing against his. You idiot! she screamed through the short-range comms, her voice breaking. You absolute stupid spacer trash analyst. Did you think we'd let you go? The, the math, Iden gasped, his vision blurring. You were supposed to stay safe. The math is wrong, Iden, she cried, pulling him toward the tether. Rennie wouldn't let the cat move. She sat on the floor and told the ship she wasn't leaving her father in the dark. The ship listened, Iden. The ship listened to her. On the homebound, the refugees were lining the corridor. Sora and the elderly Thaloric men, Vale and Kryn, were pulling the tether line with everything they had. Tarek, his legs still bandaged, was shouting encouragement. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were a crew. They were a choice. They dragged Iden and Ayara into the airlock. The door hissed shut, and the sudden rush of pressurized air felt like a miracle. Iden collapsed onto the deck, his helmet seal cracking open as Ayara tore it off. He sucked in a breath of stale, ozone-heavy air, and it was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. Renée threw herself onto his chest, her silver eyes wet with tears. The cat found you. I told her where you were hiding, and she jumped back to find you. Iden pulled the child close, his hands shaking as he stroked her white hair. He looked at Ayara, who was kneeling beside him, her jade skin finally fading back to a soft, peaceful cyan. Why? Iden asked, his voice a broken rasp. Why come back for a nobody? Viel, the eldest Thaloric, stepped forward, his eyes wise and ancient. Because a ship without its heart is just a pile of cold metal, Captain. You chose us when we were shadows in your hull. We choose you now, and every rotation hereafter. Iden looked around his ship. The hull was battered, the systems were redlining, and they were still fugitives in a galaxy that valued profit over people. But as he looked at the faces of the 8 people who had risked everything to pull him out of the dark, he realized that he had finally found what he was looking for when he left the Hegemony. He hadn't bought a ship. He had bought a beginning. All right, Iden said, his voice regaining its strength. All right. Sora, get the elders to the reactor niche. We need to stabilize the ghost drive before Vane decides to double back. Ayara, get the long-range scanners on a rotation cycle. We're not out of the soup yet. He stood up, his legs shaky but holding. He reached out and took Ayara's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. We have a lot of work to do, Iden said. We have time, Ayara replied, her lips curving into a real, certain smile. We have all the time in the universe. The homebound drifted in the quiet shadow of a rogue planetoid, leagues away from the shipping lanes and the prying eyes of the Hegemony brass. It was a nameless corner of the rift, a place where the stars were so dense they looked like spilled salt on a black velvet cloth. The ship was no longer a bleached bone. It was a patchwork quilt of repaired plates and salvaged parts, its registry now officially scrubbed and replaced with a coded signature that only a friend would recognize. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind that comes from isolation. It was the comfortable, lived-in quiet of a home. Iden Mars stood in the cockpit, his hands resting on the console. He had spent the morning deleting his old identity files, the last remnants of Kalen Voss, the freight analyst. The data tablets that once held his life were now blank, their memories wiped as clean as a fresh nebula burn. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles permanently stained with grease, and a jagged white line ran across his palm from the harpoon charge. These were the hands of a man who fixed things, not one who analyzed the cost of their breaking. Cap, Sora said, stepping into the cockpit with a mug of actual, non-synthetic coffee. The elders finished the recalibration on the oxygen scrubbers. We're holding at 98% efficiency. Tarek is even helping them with the wiring. He's a natural clank monkey, that boy. Dan took the mug, the heat warming his palms. Thanks, Sora. How are the others? Vel and Kryn are teaching Renée the old Thaloric songs in the cargo bay, Sora said, her expression softening. She's got a voice like a crystal bell, Iden. And Ayara, she's in the galley. She said if you don't show up for the midday meal, she's going to feed your portion to the ship's AI. Iden laughed, a sound that felt easy and right in his chest. I'm coming. Just give me a minute. Sora nodded and walked away, her footsteps a rhythmic domestic sound on the deck plates. Iden turned to the viewport. He thought about the man who had stood on the Raven dock line 6 months ago. That man had been looking for an escape. He had been looking for a way to be nobody because being somebody carried too much guilt. He had wanted to disappear into the vastness of the stars so he wouldn't have to look at the decimals anymore. But he had learned that the universe doesn't allow you to be nobody. Every choice, every act of kindness or indifference creates a ripple. He had tried to be a ghost, but he had accidentally become a father, a leader, and a captain. He realized now that the math of his old life had been a lie. You cannot subtract a person from a ship and expect the ship to still function. You cannot divide a family and expect the soul to remain whole. He walked into the galley. Ayara was there, stirring a large pot of stew that smelled of spices and home. She looked up as he entered, her jade skin glowing with a soft, content cyan. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and took his hand, pulling him toward the table where the others were already gathered. Eden sat down. He looked at the faces around him, the jade skin, the white hair, the tired human eyes of Sora, and the silver brilliance of Renee's gaze. They were all different, all discarded by the system, but they were here, together. He realized that he had finally found his freedom. It wasn't in the absence of responsibility, it was in the choice of it. After the meal, as the ship settled into its night cycle, Iden returned to the cockpit alone. He sat in the pilot's chair and looked out at the infinite dark. He thought of all the ships out there, the thousands of people hiding in hulls, the millions of decimals being moved across screens by people who didn't know their names. I remember the day I bought this ship, Iden mused to himself, the words a low, gravelly whisper in the quiet cockpit. I thought I was buying a piece of junk to hide in. I thought I could just drift until the fuel ran out and the numbers hit zero. I was so used to seeing the universe through a screen, calculating the cost of lives like they were just freight weights. But then I heard that cry, a small, shaky sound from inside the metal. It wasn't a decimal, it was a person, and when I opened that panel, I didn't just find Rin and Renai, I found myself. I learned that you can't run from your ghosts by being alone. You outrun them by carrying someone else for a while. I learned that a ship isn't made of titanium and plasma. It's made of the choices the people inside it make when the air gets thin. I'm not an analyst anymore. I'm a man who chose a family, and that's a math that finally adds up to something beautiful. The galaxy is cold, and the hegemony is vast. But as long as we have the cat and each other, we're never really lost in the dark. He reached for the console, his fingers moving with a new, certain grace. He didn't check the profit margins. He didn't calculate the risk of the next jump. He simply plotted a course toward the furthest, brightest star he could see. He wasn't running away anymore. He was going home. But before he hit the toggle, he looked into the darkness, as if he could see every soul still hiding in every hull in the expanse. I spent my whole life afraid of the weight of other people, thinking that every connection was just another debt to be calculated. He wondered aloud, his voice steady. I thought being alone was the only way to be free. But looking at the faces on my ship tonight, I realized I was wrong. The weight is what keeps us from drifting away. So I wonder, in this vast, indifferent universe, who are the people you would risk your math for? Who have you chosen to carry when the void gets too loud? Eden Mars smiled, a genuine, slightly awkward smile of solidarity across the stars, and slammed the throttle into the light. The homebound vanished into a rift of violet stardust, leaving behind only the fading song of a ship that finally knew where it was going.